I'm Daniel Penny, and you're listening to Non-Toxic. Having a healthy, muscular physique is a cornerstone of masculinity. But lately, it seems to have taken on an inflated importance, with many men getting a lot bigger than they used to be. Whether it's actors training to become Marvel superheroes, influencers on social media, or regular guys you're seeing at the gym, we've definitely entered an age of extreme muscularity. With the rise of steroids, SARMs, and human growth hormone, an entire generation of young men has grown up thinking that 8% body fat is normal. A study published this year found that 22% of men aged 18 to 24 reported muscularity-oriented disordered eating. Approximately 3 to 4 million people in the US use anabolic steroids for non-medical purposes, and most of them are men. The results of this lifestyle are extremely dangerous, from kidney and liver problems and heart attacks to an increased risk of suicide. And when you look at the top bodybuilders, their life expectancy is the mid-50s.
They feel very misunderstood and they feel judged, because the truth is you don't look at a 280-pound guy with 10% body fat. Culturally, we don't look at that guy as suffering.
In this episode of Non-Toxic, I'm speaking with Dr. Roberto Olivardia, clinical associate in psychology at McLean Hospital and one of the researchers who coined the term muscle dysmorphia in his book, The Adonis Complex, which was first published all the way back in 2000. Since his early research, rates of this disorder have shot up. Why are we in this situation? Well, with fewer ways to demonstrate their masculinity in other aspects of their lives by doing things like earning money or starting a family, bodybuilding has become one of the best ways to show that you're a man. I spoke with Dr. Olivardia about the social and psychological origins of muscle dysmorphia, how it connects to larger issues many men have around their masculinity, and why the disorder has become so prevalent, even as it still remains largely ignored by researchers and clinicians. Dr. Olivardia, welcome to Non-Toxic. If it's okay, I thought, we could just start with the Adonis Complex, kind of how it began 30
Sure.
years ago. You and your colleagues helped coin the term muscle dysmorphia, as far as I know,
Yes.
also known as MD. And at that time, it was a completely ignored subject in scientific literature. And most eating disorder and body dysmorphia research and treatments were really focused on women and things like anorexia and bulimia. So how did you first come into this area of research, and what made you decide to investigate it further?
Yeah, it's funny to think how many years ago that was. So I was an undergraduate at Tufts University, and I took a class on eating disorders, which was of some interest to me, but then developed into a huge interest of mine because at that time I happened to know two guys who were acquaintances who didn't know each other, who had disclosed to me that they had an eating disorder. This is in 1993. And I wanted to help them find support. Going through the yellow pages, pre-Google, every support group, everything that was offered to people who were struggling with eating disorders, none of them accepted men. So all the support groups were just women only. Any residential program, just women only. There was literally nothing, no resources for these guys who felt so much shame to that they were even dealing with this and didn't know where to go. So I wrote a paper for that class, realized the literature is very small. And then that developed into doing a senior honors thesis my senior year, where it was the first, I didn't even know at that time, but it was the first study looking at men with eating disorders drawn from the community. So all of the research up to that point had drawn men from clinical samples, men who had already been in treatment or in medical hospitals, which is important that we have that data. But that captured a very small amount of the overall men out there and got quite a response. It was college men. In Massachusetts, we have 1 million colleges, and put ads in all these newspapers and got a ton of response from men. But what was really striking about it was the messages. I wish I had kept the answering machine tape of men saying, I can't believe you're studying this. I feel seen. I've been struggling with this for years. I have no one to talk to. We paid these subjects to be part. They were like, you can keep the money. I don't even want the money. I just want to talk about this and be part of something. I mean,
Wow.
it was really emotional, honestly, like reading or hearing these messages. And so then I knew, okay, and I'm the kind of person where I'm excited by filling gaps in just whatever, and particularly in this field, I love what I do and just where are the gaps. And that study really started a trajectory for me. And Harrison Pope, who was a psychiatrist at McLean Hospital, which I had connected with, and he mentored me on this study and became my thesis advisor. And we realized this is, we need to get more information about this. So it really compelled us to do more and more research on it. And then what was interesting is, so I was doing research on men with eating disorders, anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, which had just got in the DSM at that time. It was not even, it was at that time almost like called not eating disorder, not otherwise specified. And I was hearing from men who said, I read your ad and I used to have anorexia, but I don't have anorexia now, but I kind of do, except I'm obsessed with building muscle. So I'm eating, but I'm eating very precisely and I'm measuring everything and I'm still just as concerned about my weight, but I'm not looking to be skinny. Anorexia didn't work for me, but because I really wasn't ever looking to be skinny. I wanted to be lean. And then I realized anorexia, I'm not gaining any muscle. I was hearing more and more from men who said, I was diagnosed with anorexia, but I didn't relate to these girls, the sort of typical kind of conceptualization of, I never wanted to be skinny. I wanted to be lean. And so then when we started seeing that phenomenon, we're like, oh, this is interesting. So it's not really an eating disorder. Cause at first we thought like reverse anorexia. And we're like, no, but because a lot of these men didn't have eating disorders per se. I mean, they were very obsessive compulsive about their eating, but they were eating calorically and nutritionally. Sometimes they were eating better than the average person would eat. We started to see this is like basically body dysmorphic disorder, which is a preoccupation with the part of the body. And these men were very obsessed and had a lot of compulsions around it, avoidant behaviors. But we thought it needed sort of a new name than just BDD to really classify this very specific presentation. So then we came up with the name muscle dysmorphia. We got a lot of attention from these studies that we would do, even kind of like fun, but I think important studies. Like we did the study in 97, I believe, of this was as an analogy to the classic 1980s study of the Barbie doll, that if she were a real life human female, her dimensions would be unrealistic. So we thought, what would be equivalent? We did one on GI Joe figures and
I
action
remember this from
figures.
the book.
Yeah. And that got like worldwide attention.
For people who don't know the study, what was the kind of basis for that study?
So we were able to get action figures through the decades and then current action figures. And what was to me the most striking part of that study was we got action figures from Star Wars, Luke Skywalker and Han Solo from the 70s. And then that year we did the study, Star Wars had been digitally remastered and re-released in the movie theater.
And as a kid,
Yeah. And they re-released the action figure line, but the action figures look very different than they did in the 70s. I mean, I think, Mark Hamill himself there was a quote somewhere where he said, oh my gosh, they put me on steroids because this action figure was buff and it didn't even look like the character. I mean, this is based on the same character,
supposed
but
to be like an 18, 17-year-old.
like a boy,
Yeah.
right? And he looked like he went to the gym, in those 20 years between the original Star Wars and the remaster. And so we found that a lot of those dimensions, particularly with the newer GI Joe figures, would be totally unrealistic without the use of anabolic steroids that really were promoting this more muscular kind of build. And again, the Star Wars was striking because it's based on the same character.
One of the key insights of your book, and you referred to it a moment ago, is that especially with something like an eating disorder and other body dysmorphic issues, these are products of culture. And you are looking at the 1980s and the 1990s in this book, which I think now actually feels quite quaint. like
Mhm.
the Playgirl spreads and, even like the examples of like juiced guys that are
Mhm.
in the book look to me like normal.
Mhm.
So like the Overton window has shifted so much
Oh,
in
yeah.
24 years. Yeah, I would probably say in the wrong direction. Like the book did not have, even if it was correct in its assessments and sort of diagnosis, it didn't change culture. If anything, issues around men's bodies have gotten more extreme. And
Yeah.
I know that you're working with patients, you're seeing young men and boys. Like, and I'm curious, have you seen that reflected in your practice?
Yeah, so I think absolutely that, in the book and what we know from research is eating disorders, all of these issues we look at this from a biopsychosocial perspective, that there are biological tendencies and traits that people might have, psychological things, whether it's low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, trauma, social anxiety, and then culture can sort of influence the expression of it. And at the same time, it's very important not to underestimate the power of culture and the impact of that. And the one thing when I think about Adonis complex, a lot of that material could still stand in terms of today. The one thing that would be hugely different, let's say if there was ever a revision, would be the impact of social media and the internet.
Yeah.
And so 2000, the internet was just coming out.
You would just have like your dial-up connection.
Exactly. I mean, it wasn't as accessible. I remember I got my PhD in 2000 and writing my dissertation. There was one computer in the computer lab at school that had the internet. It wasn't that available. It Social media is a whole other accelerant to these things. So I've seen two things. One, which I feel good about in terms of the book and putting that out there, is I am seeing people overall seeing less shame that a lot of the men, adult men and boys that I work with have. There's still room to move and grow in that, but overall, I've seen there's definitely more support. There are residential programs that accept men and treat men. There are support groups that help men. There are college campuses that I do consult with in terms of doing outreach to men on campus about these concerns. I'm seeing people earlier in the stages of, let's say, eating disorders in terms of treatment. Because years ago, the scientific literature said that boys and men with eating disorders have a significantly worse prognosis than women with eating disorders.
Right.
And that was confounded by the variable of how long somebody has. The longer you have an eating disorder, the harder it is to recover. It's similar to an addiction. It's not impossible. And I always tell people there's always hope. I worked with a guy who's in his early 70s who had struggled with an eating disorder for 50 years and
Wow.
recovered. And that is the testament of human, of resilience. However, it's harder. I mean, when more of your life has been interweaved. So if you have men who are not seeking treatment and they're struggling with it longer, well, the prognosis is going to be worse. Now, if they get into treatment earlier, we find that we don't see that there's something inherently worse about the prognosis. It's gone in a direction that's not so good, is I'm now seeing younger boys than I've ever seen. The accessibility to things like anabolic steroids, to just products, weight loss kind of products, fat burning products, a lot of them, which are very harmful. A lot of them are completely useless and they're being scammed. That the accessibility to these quote unquote tools, they're not really tools, that and this pressure is definitely something unlike I've ever seen, before. The intensity of it is something unlike we've ever seen. This is true for girls, obviously, as well, but where I work with boys who are getting information from influencers who are some of whom aren't even hiding it. I mean, some of them are like, hey, steroids are not that bad for you. So what if you shave off 5, like if you get X, Y, and Z? I mean, like some of them aren't even pretending, anymore. Which is like, so now as a clinician, I'm working against information that people are getting from non-credible individuals who have no credentials or anything. Well, that's the credential. Exactly. So there's no academic sort of training or knowledge, but they have the goods in that sense. And so that is a whole very different variable in the work that I do with people, because now when I work with an individual of any age with these issues, that's part of the intake is, who are you following on Instagram? What are your social media channels? And I get a list, and a lot of them are the same ones that I hear. And then some are new people. And I feel I take it on myself to learn about these influencers and understand what is the messaging. It helps me do my work with my patients to hear what they're being kind of fed in that way.
Who are some of the most prominent influencers in the muscle building, testosterone, steroid
Ugh.
taking
Well, the good
world?
old Liver King was one that
Liver
would come up
King,
a lot.
RIP.
Of
I mean, he's not
course.
dead, but he
Yeah.
he lost his crown.
He lost his crown, and at the same time, he did and he didn't. I mean, in the sense that it's amazing how, and this is what I remember a study way back looking at Photoshop and found that, you know, a lot of body image advocacy groups would say, hey, let's expose how photoshopping, these girls that are looking at these models, like they're shaving off their hips and they're doing this, X, Y, and Z. And the sad thing is, studies show that even when people are shown the Photoshop, it doesn't matter, because once people see an idealized image, it almost doesn't matter that it's artificial in terms of the impact it can have on someone's self esteem. Because once someone sees an ideal image and they don't look that way, even when they know it's fake, even when they know it's pharmaceutically enhanced in some way, it's still an idealized image. And it almost that takes a backseat. And that's especially true for a developing brain. So when you have an adolescent, and it's not just with young boys. I mean, I work with men in their 30s and 40s who follow people and advice. And there's some people they might follow where the advice is healthy and could be really good. But when you're struggling with these kinds of issues, the vulnerability is going to orient you more towards people who are instant, quick results, flashy, that they're looking for to achieve a certain body to gain something, whether it's love, respect, looking intimidating, whatever that may be for them.
You're listening to Non-Toxic. More of my conversation with Dr. Olivardia in a moment. If you're liking this episode, take a pause and make sure to rate and review us, or even better yet, tell a friend. It's how people discover the show. This episode of Non-Toxic is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles. Made of 100% pure beeswax in Colorado, they burn beautifully and smell amazing. And most importantly, they're not made with any petroleum. You can get 20% off on your first order with the code NONTOXIC, capital N, capital T, one word. Now back to our conversation. Let's talk about what men gain, I think, through this process. Because I think in the second chapter, you and your colleagues speculate that the Adonis complex is perhaps related to social and economic changes of the late 20th century, things like deindustrialization and
Mhm.
rise of women in the workplace. And you argue that these changes have threatened one of the core foundations of masculinity, which is breadwinning, essentially.
Yes.
And therefore, men are being pushed to define themselves against women physically by bulking up their bodies. That this is a way to say, hey, I'm still a man.
Right.
Uh, and I think, we're living in a moment that is even perhaps more extreme in terms of the dislocation that many young men are feeling culturally and economically in America and all around the world. And it's fueled a huge rise in far right politics. Like
Hmm.
the anti-feminist backlash is a big part of, MAGA. And I'm curious to
Yeah.
hear about kind of, have you noticed any changes in your patients in terms of them seeing their masculinity through this and their muscularity through this lens, that it's not just about like, well, I need to be big to be impress girls, but that there's like almost like an ideological element, or is that more unstated?
No, I would say absolutely. I mean, Jordan Peterson, who is a fellow psychologist, but I disagree with him on many things. He comes up a lot in this area because you're right that this is where culture intersects. I am hearing it less around, right? I want to build this to get girls or get guys for guys who identify as gay. It's more around this idea of commanding respect and not being sort of pushed around in a way. And it's not that I didn't hear that years ago. I'm hearing that more and more now, though, where
Mhm.
it's less about I want to look good, that language, even though it's all, again, all of this was probably intertwined before what's being coded expressive, in a more expressive way, commanding respect. And this idea that a disciplined man is, like a stoic kind of disciplined man is the ideal man in that way. So, and that comes through. I mean, sometimes, I'll work with someone who maybe is eating like an all meat, like a carnivorous diet, like an all meat diet. And so it's not technically, again, like this eating disorder where the person is not eating calories or whatnot, but maybe their doctors told them like, this is not good for your cholesterol. And I'm not saying, yeah, I'm not a nutritionist, so I wouldn't say this diet is all good or all bad for whoever, but this particular individual was told by
But
his
it's
physician.
an extreme diet regardless.
Extreme,
Yeah.
exactly. And so he was told by his physician, this is not good for your family history and your cholesterol. Like, you need to integrate. And he follows these people that are very much like all meat, but are very tied to this ideology that meat is masculinity, and this is something, we've seen years ago. I remember I was a vegetarian many years ago when I was big into animal rights. I still feel strongly about animal rights, but I remember even in high school, college, how it was weird to me that meat eating was so tied to like being, men, and this idea that being a vegetarian was this sort of almost assault, on
I mean, and
masculinity.
now they call them you're a soy boy.
Right. Exactly. This diminutive kind of way of looking at masculinity and with body image. I mean, one of the things we talked about, right, in the Adonis complex was that we just see these trends because with boys and men, we really didn't see, when people ask me, were these issues always there? We just didn't see them. Yes. And at the same time, it is rising because we didn't see it to this degree in the 60s and the 70s. And we've done studies looking at like advertisements, and we didn't see unclothed men's bodies as much in the 60s, 70s. The biggest Hollywood stars were not known for their bodies in that way. And what we see culturally is like typically, and we make it very, very clear that this is not blaming the feminist women's liberation movement, which is a very positive cultural revolution that needed to happen. And to understand that when that happened, just as it changed the way that women saw themselves in good ways, that they could be the stay at home mom if they want to be, they can be working in the corporate America if they want to be, that there were choices, that there were reproductive choices that hopefully they can still have in 2024. It did shift now this sort of way of how men started to see themselves, and in ways that made sort of the mass of men uncomfortable in some sense. Not every guy, but for a lot of men, I'm like, wait a minute, like women are able to be in the military. Like, who's and they're able to be the breadwinner and all of that. How do we define which, and this is, what I appreciate about this generation, this younger generation is really putting to task. What are we even talking about when we're talking about masculinity? What is that? Like, is masculinity being tough and assertive? Does that mean then if you're a woman who's tough and assertive, you're like a man? If you're sensitive, does that make you like a woman, or are you just a human being who's sensitive or who's assertive? Like, why are we categorizing these? But we have seen culturally that when there is that kind of progress of moving toward equality, that you start to see these more heightened kind of emphases on the male body. And size and strength and everything. And right wing outlets talking about red light for your testicles and keeping, your keeping your balls healthy and like all of this, like this emphasis on asserting that the body now becomes a sort of assertion.
I think one interesting difference is that we have seen the so-called body positivity movement have some effect on young women, but I don't hear a lot of young men or see a lot of images of young men talking about body positivity or even
Mhm,
body neutrality. Whereas there really is a sort of alternative that's been formed and put forward for girls. You can reject this and have this other way, but there's no body positivity for young men.
mm-mm. No, not at all.
Is that something
It's
like what
real
you have a challenge with as when you're dealing with patients, like
definitely,
how to change their mindset?
definitely, because they can point out, I mean, I'll have young men who are on dating apps and they'll get direct feedback sometimes from young women who are like, I'm looking for a guy that's fitter, or other men, who is this, who is that. Like they can point out, like, these are all of these. And so, yeah, there isn't this sort of sense of positivity. I mean, part of what I try to work with them on is how they can sort of optimize, because there's nothing wrong with eating well and working out and enhancing sort of what your appearance, provided that you're doing it in a healthy way. But it's keeping track of what's the thing we're really looking for at the end of the day, because it's not really about, I mean, if it's about health, that's great. But I can tell you that steroids is not going to get you into that camp. If it's love, if it's attention, if it's respect, okay, well, we can work on those things. But this idea that the body has, pun intended, embodied sort of these characteristics, that's what the work is often. And for these people in their journey of realizing, not only does it not grant them those things in the ways that are really fulfilling, like if you are the biggest guy in the room, if you're the fittest guy in the room, sure, you're going to get looks, if you have the six pack and at 19 and, people are going to be like, whoa, you have a six pack. Okay. And then what? Then what comes after that? And that's where it actually is almost like less fulfilling for these men that I work with. They're like, it's almost like a false promise that somehow all these things are going to be granted to them. And we know this about appearance research, is that yes, people who are seen as more attractive, there are perks to being an attractive person. I would never deny that. I'm not someone that would ever say looks don't matter. Like that's just crap. Of course, there's an impact, but in the ways that people think, it on the long term, studies show that attractive people are overall not happier individuals. Physical health is actually one of the probably the number one factor for happiness. If you're a physically healthy person, if attractive people, let's say, have more confidence, and confidence makes them engage in opportunities and take part, well, then that could be helpful. But guess what? We can learn to be assertive regardless of how you look and grab opportunities that are on your plate and get you to where you need to get to at the same time. And that's the conversation and the work, really.
I want to talk about treatment because at the top of our conversation, you mentioned that when you were first doing this book, there were like no treatment options for your friends who had
Yeah.
confessed to you that they had eating disorders. I've admittedly done a cursory research, but I haven't actually found very much treatment focused on boys and men for what apparently is an extremely prevalent disorder, either at least in its sort of mildest forms, but even at kind of the extreme end, that there are,
Yes.
you know, thousands or even hundreds of thousands of young men in America who have some form of muscle dysmorphia. I don't think that there are nearly the number of clinics and clinicians to meet them. So I guess this is a kind of a two-part question. Like one, where are these treatments happening and how is the treatment for muscle dysmorphia and kind of young men with muscle dysmorphia or even older men? But I think it sounds like the majority of your patients are under 30. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say that with eating disorders, I've seen all ages.
Sure. But yeah, how do you basically who's treating muscle dysmorphia and
Mm,
how do you treat it? Because it just seems like when I look at, inpatient treatment centers for body dysmorphia, I don't see anything still that is catered
Yeah.
towards young men. So it doesn't seem like, despite the fact that this has become more prevalent, that there's actually been an increase in treatment options to match it.
Yeah. So with muscle dysmorphia specifically, there really aren't many options that, being in Boston, I'm affiliated with McLean Hospital, which is top psychiatric hospital in the country. I did all my training there, and they have really the world's best residential program for OCD, for obsessive compulsive disorder. It's called the OCD Institute. And through there, because muscle dysmorphia is a subtype of body dysmorphic disorder is considered an obsessive compulsive spectrum disorder. So it's not the same as OCD, but it's like a cousin of OCD. So
Okay.
the treatment is very similar in terms of exposure therapy, reducing avoidant behaviors, engaging in cognitive skills of reframing a lot of negative, inaccurate thoughts that people would have, increasing adaptive behaviors. It's not the majority of patients are not going there for BDD, they go there for OCD, but they work with people with BDD, of which some of them, I remember that when I first started my training there, one of the first patients, it was 3 people in this BDD group, and he had muscle dysmorphia. And so there was a treatment modality around that. So that's where those patients on a residential level are going to be best treated, is in programs that target OCD, BDD. There's definitely no like muscle dysmorphia focus program per se, but they can respond well, with those treatment methods. On an outpatient level, the problem is that most men with muscle dysmorphia are not coming in sort of willingly to say, I want to treat my muscle dysmorphia. A lot of times the men through that route is they've had an injury, and due to that injury, they're not able to work out or have the same routine, and they get suicidal, they get depressed, they get very irritable. And then that's what brings them to therapy. Some of them have had major health adverse consequences from taking, let's say, anabolic steroids, and that's what might bring them in. Their spouse is going to divorce them because they are obsessed with their bodies, and they're asking their spouse 100 times a day, am I bigger than I was yesterday? Do I look smaller? Am I bigger than that guy? And it drives their partners crazy. So usually it's for that. Now, occasionally I'll have somebody that's heard me on a podcast or read Adonis Complex and said, oh my gosh, like this is me and my whole life is spinning. And it's usually, again, like I remember this man I treated years ago, and he said, his wife was pregnant with their son. And he's like, this isn't sustainable. Like, I know I don't want this, and I want to be an available father. This particular person, his father was absent in his life, which through work, he realized contributed to his muscle dysmorphia of sort of having almost this becoming the idealized sort of man that he felt he lacked sort of a lot of male role models when he was growing up. So I do see that, but a lot of times I don't, it's not that I think if there were a residential program designed I don't think you'd have men necessarily coming in droves, because there's a lot of resistance, because in the same way with anorexia, I mean, the truth is that only 10% of women, 10% of women who have an eating disorder get treatment for it. That is so low. There's a lot because imagine if your goal is to get big and muscular and you're going to treatment, and the first questions I often get asked is, what is the goal here? Are you going to am I supposed to be okay with being the Pillsbury Doughboy? Are you basically saying like, I should just accept my ugliness or my being scrawny, or you're going to make me get off steroids, aren't you? Which is going to make me lose muscle mass, which I don't want, which is freaking me out. There's so much ambivalence
Mm.
around it, in the same way that you see with anorexia. Like you're coming to treatment, part of treatment is going to be weight restoration, is going to be caloric intake. And so if that is the thing that you're fighting, it's really hard. I mean,
Yeah.
that when the nature of the illness, like versus when I'm treating someone with OCD, I mean, they'll say, okay, I know exposure therapy is going to be scary and doing this, but no part of me wants to be riddled with rituals and obsessions. No part of someone who's struggling with deep depression wants to be, there's no
It's not part of their
reward in it.
identity in the same
And
way.
absolutely. And there is an identity to this and a culture associated with this too. This idea of, if with muscle dysmorphia in particular, if I give this up, like, well, then I could be giving up a peer group. I could be giving up, a status. I could be giving up and ultimately an identity of what all of this kind of is. And that's very scary, understandably. In residential places, you have very few options, but also when these men seek treatment, they're very aware of like, who am I going to put my trust in? Because you're vulnerable. What's interesting of what I loved about running that for people with BDD, and these were people who some of them had skin preoccupations, hair, muscle size. But what was great about that group was, and it was always a fairly small group, these are people who have preoccupations that are distorted, in
Yeah.
some ways, and so you might have someone complaining about how ugly his or her skin looks, and other people are looking at them like, what are they talking about? Like their skin looks great. And they're like, their skin looks great, but look at my nose and my nose looks ugly. And so sometimes there's that comparison. And then also there's this insight too. Like, and I remember interestingly having, it was two men in the group and one had muscle dysmorphia and the other had sort of preoccupation. He didn't necessarily want to be big enough, but he felt his body looked very disproportionate and alien looking and he looked fine. And in the group, you're not, people are not supposed to comment on like, you look great, because we don't want to sort of get into reassurance seeking. But the man who had muscle dysmorphia at some point during the day had commented to the other man in a very offhanded comment, something like complimenting how like his clothes sort of fit on him or something like that. And he was like, he couldn't believe, he's like, how does he see me that way? Like I look so bad. And here he is, he looks so built and fit. But meanwhile, that patient thinks he looks scrawny and ugly. So when people can see that in other people and be like, wow, that person is so distorted with how they're seeing themselves. I think maybe that's how I'm seeing myself. And that is the power of like group therapy and people being able to talk about that. With BDD, there are some groups, I don't know of any, but I know there've been some of those sort of around. But muscle dysmorphia would be interesting to have a whole group of men with that, because I think you'd see, and this is where the dynamic, and I, did a study years ago comparing men with muscle dysmorphia to men with anorexia and found that they were fairly similar on almost all scales except just the manifestation. Because with anorexia, this is always an issue in residential programs, inpatient programs with groups, is girls with anorexia will compare themselves to other girls saying, oh, like she's 75 pounds. I wish I was that skinny. I wish I was that
Mhm.
sick.
Competitive.
A competitiveness,
Mm.
exactly. But I would love that opportunity. I
But
mean,
they're
to
always
have,
in that competition in the gym in a sense.
yeah,
They're checking each other out. Who's the biggest, who
definitely.
can bench the most. But maybe in a sort of therapeutic setting, it would be flipped.
Absolutely. That you know that that's gonna come, but the idea that you can work with that and then turn it into, something else, because the person who's really sick doesn't feel great when she's being tube fed, that, or the guy that might be really big, and some of the patients I work with, and they'll say to me, they're like, if people only knew how my life is dominated by this, like there's nothing I'm getting from this. I'm exhausted by it. I can't imagine living to 60 years old. Like this, they feel very misunderstood and they feel judged, because the truth is you don't look at a 280-pound guy with 10% body fat. Culturally, we don't look at that guy as suffering in the
Yeah.
same way that we might see a 70-pound anorexic female in that way. And these guys overall are some of the most sensitive, vulnerable, insightful. I mean, this image of like being like the meathead and being intellectually compromised. Some of these guys are some of the most brilliant guys that I've worked with who are very emotional and have such, but they have a hard time connecting to that and expressing that. And sometimes it's because they feel so much of that vulnerability that they're almost so frightened of it that they've now expressed themselves in this way culturally as being the very opposite. At some point in their lives, that was seen as a liability to them. And they were taught culturally, familially, peer wise, in some ways that was a liability.
This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for sharing some of your insights.
You too. Take care.
And that's it for this episode of Non-Toxic. This episode of Non-Toxic was hosted by me, Daniel Penny, and produced by Loose Thread Studios with help from Andrew Lewis. Our music is by Nathan Sharp, and our artwork is by Sam Creasy. If you want to support the show, go to patreon.com/nontoxicpodcast and sign up to become a supporter today.